Good afternoon. This is retired pastor Naomi Barcanic coming to you from Spirit of Joy Lutheran Church in Clarkdale, Arizona. I've been asked to join with you to do a Bible study in this Lenten season. The topic will be Who Killed Jesus? Were King Herod, Roman governor Pontius Pilate, high priest Caiaphas, Jesus' disciple Judas Iscariot, Barabbas, the criminal, were they all merely puppets in God's orchestrated plan? Or did each one of them act out of his own free will? So join me now in this series of devotions that Spirit of Joy invites you to ponder who killed Jesus and look at some key people who impacted the journey of Jesus to the cross. Today we will be looking at Caiaphas, the high priest of the temple in Jerusalem at the time of Jesus. There is virtually nothing written about him in the history books outside of the New Testament Gospels, except that it was recorded historically that he was high priest from the years 18 to 36 in the Common Era. That means an 18-year reign that rarely had any stability. It's so easy to forget that Caiaphas, although a high priest, was still subject to the regulations of the Romans, and he was dependent on them to renew his term of office year after year after year. Now, weeks before Caiaphas and Jesus ever met, Jesus had raised Lazarus from the dead. Remember Lazarus? He was the brother of Mary and Martha and a very, very good friend of Jesus. Well, of course, raising Lazarus from the dead was a big deal, big news. News that made the Pharisees, who were the religious authorities of the day, quite worried and very nervous. After all, Jesus was upsetting their apple cart of religious authority and control. If they lost control of the people, the Romans would come running to them for answers. So the Pharisees, in fear, ran to the high priest Caiaphas and pressured him to do something finally about this Jesus. Ironically, Caiaphas, as a high priest, told them that a prophecy had come to him sometime in that very year that Jesus would die for his people. But in my research, most scholars believe Caiaphas received no such prophecy. For way back in the Old Testament times, God would indeed speak through the prophets and the high priests. But now here in the first century of the Common Era, so much had changed. These high priest offices were not religious offices as much as they were positions of wealth and security. As long as they did what the Romans wanted, and that was to keep their flock under control and not cause problems for the Romans, Caiaphas took advantage of the authority of his office, all the perks, the wealth, the security. But he also knew it was the Romans who would dismiss him at any time if he didn't follow their agenda, which meant keeping his people keeping the Jewish people under control. Caiaphas hated Jesus as much as the other religious leaders of the day simply because Jesus had become a thorn in their sides. So this so-called prophecy that Caiaphas talked about to the Pharisees was really only a ploy, not a divine prophecy at all, but instead a political scheming of his to finally deal with this Jesus who was causing so much unrest and turmoil. Caiaphas had used the tradition of prophecy to his own advantage. Therefore, after that meeting, the longing to kill Jesus moved from intention on the part of those religious leaders to official decision and resolve. Caiaphas had deviously given the Pharisees the go-ahead. We don't hear much about Caiaphas again until after Judas Iscariot's betrayal of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. It was to the Jewish high priest Caiaphas that Jesus was brought, because one of the duties of Caiaphas was to preside over the Jewish court called the Sanhedrin, on which many Pharisees sat. This was the court that accused Jesus of blasphemy when Caiaphas asked him the question, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of God?" Listen now to a reading from Matthew chapter 26 from the Message, a wonderful contemporary reading of the Bible from its original language. Matthew 26. The high priest, conspiring with the Jewish council, tried to cook up charges against Jesus in order to sentence him to death. But even though many stepped up, making one false accusation after another, nothing was believable. Finally, two men came forward with this. "Well, this Jesus said, 'I can tear down this temple of God and after 3 days rebuild it.'" The chief priest Caiaphas stood up and said, "Jesus, what do you have to say to this accusation?" Jesus kept silent. Then the chief priest again said, "I command you by the authority of the living God to say if you are the Messiah, the Son of God." Jesus was curt. "You yourself said it. And that's not all. Soon you'll see for it yourself." At that, the chief priest Caiaphas lost his temper, ripping his robes, yelling, "He blasphemed! Why do we need witnesses to accuse him? You all heard him blaspheme. Are you going to stand for such blasphemy?" They all said, "Death." That seals his death sentence. Then they were spitting in his face and banging him around. They jeered as they slapped him. "Prophesy, Messiah. Who hit you that time?" I read that there is a 14th century painting hanging in the Cathedral of Siena in Italy that portrays Caiaphas's rage with Jesus as he accuses him of blasphemy against God. Just as our text in Matthew describes, Caiaphas in this painting is tearing his own garments, a ritual that symbolized extreme sorrow, pity, or rage. No doubt for Caiaphas, this was an act of rage, or possibly just good showmanship. Caiaphas held a religious office, yet he used it for his own benefit. He knew he had a good thing going, and nothing was going to deprive him of his privileges. His position of power and his fear of losing that power were front and center when it came to dealing with Jesus. What if, instead, as a truly holy man of God, he tried to understand what there was about this Jesus that made him so popular among so many people? But he couldn't do that because that would rock the boat. And no one rocks the boat who wants to stay in power. So Caiaphas's impulses to get rid of Jesus was simply to save his own neck and to get back to business as usual so that he could keep his job and all the perks that went with it. And so the question I bring to you today is, was he a puppet in God's divine plan? Or did he use his own free will in condemning Jesus to death? Did he do the best he could in his role as high priest? When do you think he misused his office? Ponder these questions for yourselves. Whatever your answers, one thing is clear. It was the high priest Caiaphas who started the ball rolling that led Jesus to the cross. Next time, we'll be looking at Herod of Antipas, ruler of Galilee.